it's hard to talk about him. It's very emotional. He's the master of masters. The boom of Latin American literature that took the world by assault in the second half of the century began in 1963 with a novel by an unknown writer called Mario Vargas Llosa. And that's the moment when the world noticed that we had great writers. And it was a choir of many voices, but the most important voice, the voice that really was the pillar of this movement, was García Márquez with 100 Years of Solitude. And every novel that he wrote afterward was not only acclaimed by the critics and translated, and he had innumerable awards, but they were popular novels. It was like reading Dickens or Balzac. People in the streets read García Márquez. Every book he wrote had popular acclaim. So he in a way, he conquered readers and conquered the world and told the world about us, Latin Americans, and told us who we are. In his pages, we saw ourselves in a mirror, in a way.
Amazingly, in his own country, he was virtually, for a literary figure, it's unusual. He was like a rock star. Everything that García Márquez said or did, the country followed and talked about. And
the world.
Yes.
But you know, in Latin America, that is not a rare event. In Latin America, some writers, because they were writers, have been elected president. Writers are consulted as if they were prophets or astrologers. They are supposed to know everything. And in a way, it makes sense. Because in such a complicated and weird continent as Latin America is, somehow writers summarize our reality, the collective dreams, the collective hopes, the fears. They give us back our history, which is usually magical and horrible.
Do you remember when you first read 100 Years of Solitude?
Yeah. The novel was published in 1967, and I read it a year later. I had given birth to my son, Nicolas, who was born in 1966, and I had gone back to work. I was working in a women's magazine. And I remember when I read the book, I didn't go to work. I just sat there with the book until I finished it. It was as if someone was telling me my own story. It was my family, my country, the people I knew. To me, there was nothing magical about it. It was my grandmother. I also grew up in the house of my grandparents, as he did. The story that we just heard about his manuscript of sending it in 2 batches because he couldn't afford. The same happened with the House of the Spirits many years later. I was living in Venezuela, didn't have money to send the whole manuscript. It went in 2 batches. So there were so many similarities. We have the same agent, Carmen Balcells, who often she would say to me that I had reactions like him. For example, we would receive a contract. We never read the contracts, we just signed them. And suddenly, for no reason in particular, we would read it and say, no, this one I'm not going to sign. So, you know that kind of stuff.
She was in Spain.
She was in Spain. That kind of stuff in which you feel totally identified with his words, with his work, with his personality. He was a difficult man, but he was so creative, so quick in response. He was an amazing man.
And what was it about 100 Years of Solitude that made it such a powerful book, not just in Latin America, but throughout the world? I mean, here's this basically the story of several generations of a family in a forgotten part of Colombia, a small little town, isolated from the world, invented
place.
And what was it about that book that made it such an important and seminal work?
I think that what happened with magic realism and why people all over the world connected to it is because the world and life are very mysterious. We don't control anything. We have no explanations for everything. And we try to live in a controlled world because we feel safe. And in this book and the books that followed, there was this explosion of the unbelievable, which is around us all the time. And it's an acceptance that we don't control anything, there are no explanations, that there is something, there are spirits, there are coincidences, prophetic dreams, things that happen that are magical because we cannot explain them. I suppose that centuries ago, any phenomenon like electricity would be considered magical. Maybe in 200 years of solitude, we will be able to explain what is now magical to us.
In this clip from the 1998 documentary, Gabriel García Márquez, A Witch Writing Literature, García Márquez talks about the role women played in his life when he was a young boy.
We were the only two men in a house full of women. My life was a strange one because the women, who were ruled over by my grandmother, were living in a supernatural world, a fantastic world where everything was possible. The most unbelievable things were part of everyday life. I got used to this way of thinking, but my grandfather was the most down-to-realistic man I have ever known. He would tell me about the Civil War and all the political tricks. He spoke to me as if I was an adult. So I was split between two worlds. The world of my grandfather, whom I spent my days with, as he dedicated a lot of his time to me, and the world of the women, in parallel with my grandfather's, but with which I stayed alone at night.
Gabriel García Márquez elaborated on the influence his grandmother had on him as a child and developing writer. This is a clip of an interview he did with the Spanish broadcaster RTVE. My grandmother was like my mother to me. She was a person who was quite superstitious. I always had the impression she had a secret link to certain supernatural powers, because in my infancy it was always a marvel to see how she always had a way of knowing things and foreseeing things and having prophecies that would be fulfilled. She was a nervous type and she died at a very old age and quite delirious, of course. But the other thing I remember well is that she spoke a type of Spanish that was extraordinary, full of archaism, spellbinding images. This has been a launching point for me as a writer. I have now researched all her terminology, all her refrains, her words. Now I know them all consciously, but I grew up with those words and those terms with that construction, as if it was the natural speech of the people because it was what she used in her speech. With that language, I wrote my books. Gabriel García Márquez, speaking to the Spanish broadcaster RTVE. Our guest for the hour is Isabel Allende, in this exclusive extended interview with her, responding to Gabriel García Márquez's death. Magic realism, how was that phrase coined and the influence it's had on, well, you as a writer and people all over the world?
Well, I understand that first of all, García Márquez did not invent it. He was the great, the one who was able to put it together in such a fantastic way that it was accepted all over. But it began long before. I would say that magic realism begins with the conquistadors that came to Latin America. And they were writing these letters to the king or to Spain, in which they talk about a continent that had fountains of youth, that you could pick up the gold and the diamonds from the floor, that people had unicorns or had 1 foot so big that at siesta time they would raise it like a parasol to have shade. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is in the conquistadors' letters. So in that magical beginning of Latin America and Spain together, this reality was created. And great a great Cuban writer, was the one who first put the term together. And then Garcia Márquez popularized it. But it is said that it began in Germany, that the first person who ever put together magic and realism was in Germany.
Can you read the words of Gabriel García Márquez, those words that you read when you were staying home from work because you couldn't put the book down?
In Spanish or in English?
In both.
In both. Let me start with Spanish because in Spanish they sound so much better. This is the beginning of Cien Años de Soledad. Muchos años después, frente al pelotón de fusilamiento, el coronel Aureliano Buendía había de recordar aquella tarde remota en que su padre lo llevó a conocer el hielo. Macondo era entonces una aldea de 20 casas de barro y caña brava, construidas a la orilla de un río de aguas diáfanas que se precipitaban por un lecho de piedras pulidas, blancas y enormes como huevos prehistóricos. El mundo era tan reciente que muchas cosas carecían de nombre y para mencionarlas había que señalarlas con el dedo. Now in English. Many years later, as he faced the firing squad, Colonel Aureliano Buendía was to remember that distant afternoon when his father took him to discover ice. At that time, Macondo was a village of 20 adobe houses built on the bank of a river of clear water that ran along a bed of polished stones, which were white and enormous, like prehistoric eggs. The world was so recent that many things lacked names, and in order to indicate them, it was necessary to point.
That's Isabel Allende reading from Gabriel García Márquez's 100 Years of Solitude.
Well, Isabel, one of the obviously one of the big influences on his life was not only his own family upbringing, but the political climate in which he grew up. From the time of the infamous La Violencia in Colombia, where over 300,000 people were killed in a civil war, to later on the drug wars in Colombia, the enormous dislocation of Colombian society. Talk about his political views and development and how he showed them through his literature.
He was always a leftist, and he became friends with Fidel Castro very early on during the Cuban Revolution. He was adored in Cuba, and he lived there and visited Cuba many times. He formed the Film Institute in Havana. And his views, his leftist views, brought him a lot of trouble in Colombia. He couldn't live in Colombia for a while because his life was threatened. He lived in Mexico, he lived in many other places, and he died in Mexico, actually. So he's not the only one, because many of our writers of that time lived in exile and wrote in exile in Europe and other places because it was unsafe to live in their own countries. It happened also in Chile. A wave of Chilean writers left after the military coup, and they wrote in exile.
I want to go to this clip from the documentary, again, Gabriel García Márquez, A Witch Writing Literature, where he talks about his time in Paris, as we talk about the exile. It was the 50s. He had fled Colombia, and how many of his fellow writers from Latin America who were also in Paris faced dictators at home.
What had been important for me in Paris was the perspective I acquired in Latin America. Because in Latin America, I was just a Colombian, a Caribbean, and I deeply am a Caribbean. But in Paris, I became a Caribbean, aware of this culture, and of the more general culture, the Caribbean culture, fits itself into. In the cafes, I regularly met Argentinians, people from Central America, Mexicans, Caribbeans from different countries.
It was at the time of the dictators. There was Rojas Pinilla in Colombia, Perez Jimenez in Venezuela, Odria in Peru, Trujillo in Santo Domingo. There was Perón in Argentina. There were dictators nearly everywhere. There was Batista in Cuba. I was living in a pension in Cuja Street, right in the Latin quarters. The poet Nicolas Guillen was living in a pension opposite mine. Our visits to him were like a pilgrimage. Each of us expected news from his country. One early morning, as he woke up as early as he used to in Cuba, he leaned out of his window and shouted, "He has fallen." Everyone believed it was the dictator of his own country.
That was Gabriel García Márquez, a Witch Writing Literature, a 1998 documentary speaking about his time in Paris in exile in the 50s. Isabel Allende, you were just describing this. And also talking about what influenced him, your own country, your cousin, the president of Chile, Salvador Allende, taken down by Pinochet, died in the palace on another September 11th, 1973.
Yeah, and García Márquez wrote about that. He was very active against the dictatorship. At the time, Chile was like the most visible military coup and dictatorship in the world. The world paid a lot of attention to Chile, but there were dictators all over Latin America. There were, very soon the dirty war started in Argentina, and then in Uruguay, the situation in Uruguay was awful. Brazil, in many places, there was nowhere to go. There were masses of people running away from their own countries and trying to find refuge in another place, and then there would be a dictatorship in the other place. That happened to many Chileans that went to Argentina and died in Argentina. So García Márquez, who was aware of all this and had already lived it in his youth, in his own country, and he was in Paris because he was running away from repressive governments, wrote about that. And in his book, The Autumn of the Patriarch, he, in a great metaphor of all of Latin America, he summarizes the horror of autocratic governments and ignorance and abuse, exploitation, killings. I think that book represents all those dictatorships.